In 1989, Warner Brothers rejuvenated the superhero movie with the iconic character of Batman. A year later in 1990, Touchstone Pictures brought a comic book from the 1930s to life with the legendary Dick Tracy. And in 1991, well, Disney took a character that was at the back of a few 80s comics no one ever heard of and made a superhero movie. On this episode of Moving Panels, we discuss The Rocketeer. Welcome to Moving Panels, the podcast where we discuss movies and TV shows based on, inspired by, and adapted from the world of comic books. I'm your host, Laramy Wells, and joining me today is Chad Smith. How are you, Chad?
I'm doing good, Laramy. How's it going, man? Happy birthday, buddy.
Thank you. Yes, the month of June, my birthday falls, so I've been celebrating anniversaries. We did the 40th anniversary of The Greatest American Hero in the last full episode, and now we are doing the 30th anniversary of The Rocketeer.
Yeah, that's kind of scary because I vividly remember waiting to see this movie.
Oh, you're not alone. You are not alone. I remember seeing it. I remember getting two 2-liter Coke bottles and taping them together and strapping them somehow to my back and having my own little rocket.
Yep. Yeah, I think I stole something out of my dad's toolbox for the little actuator on your hand, you know? You had to have something with a button, you know, to activate the rocket. So, oh, man.
Oh, nostalgia. All right, so this movie to the day is 30 years old. It was released on June 21st, 1991. Of course, it is a Disney movie. They were trying to piggyback off the success of Tim Burton's Batman in 1989. Obviously, in the early 90s, you had lots of them. Dick Tracy, The Phantom, The Shadow, apparently a bunch of 30s comic book characters all coming out there. But this was Disney doing their best to follow suit. Unfortunately, I think it was too little too late, but we'll get into that later. The character of the Rocketeer and the comic itself was created by Dave Stevens, who actually does get credit as a producer on the movie.
Yeah. Before
he created this character, he was a storyboard artist in Hollywood, and he had more ties with comic books. He actually worked on the Super Friends cartoon series. Famously, he worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark. And ultimately, when you see this comic, this dude was amazing. An amazing artist.
Yeah. The artwork, the story, we'll get into this, of course, but the stories can be a little all over the place, but the artwork is absolutely phenomenal. The other one that I like is that he was the storyboard artist for Michael Jackson's Thriller.
Oh, yeah.
Which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, and the thing was, it's kind of funny, and we'll get into more of this probably a little later, but the comics were so short because it wasn't a full comic. It was like 6 pages stuck in the back of another comic book. And the thing was, he was such an artist and he was such a stickler for the details that he wasn't quick getting these out. He was very slow getting these out because of how detailed he was with the artwork.
Yeah, there's more work that's been done since than he ever did. Like that is kind of interesting to me. But of course, like his core run of stuff, like you said, was like really short panels, and it unfortunately story-wise kind of hurt him a little bit because, in my opinion, anyways, it does. You definitely get the idea that he worked on it for a little while and there was this kind of long pause and then he would come back to it. So the story changed, just the way he tells story changes. So you do get this kind of strange difference and stuff. But
yeah, it has a weird flow to it when you're reading it.
Yeah.
But he was clearly inspired by the movie serials of the 1950s, specifically King of the Rocket Men and Commando Cody, Sky Marshal of the Universe. I am not familiar with either one of those, but I did my research, and that is what he was basing this character off of.
Well, and clearly he's just in love with the 50s in general, like the 50s, early 60s Americana. I mean, his art style, his clear love affair with Betty Page, like the you know, the whole thing. So he loves 1950s America.
Yeah. So he inspired this off of 1950s America. It's based in the 1930s, 40s, because it starts in 1938. I think it gets into the 40s in later stories. But yet this is not a comic from that day and age. This is a 1980s comic. And that's it's just crazy.
Yeah. He was not alone, though. I mean, if you think about it. So I would kind of go credit the beginning of the pulp comics craze of the early 90s with, I think, Who Framed Roger Rabbit kicked a lot of it off. So that's 88, I think. So you kind of start with that. And then, Dick Tracy was a 90. This is 91. There was a lot, it even kind of progressed into music. You had the Brian Setzer Orchestra, kind of revisiting that time period, all that sort of
stuff. Billy Joel
so,
did it too, yeah.
Yeah. So he was not alone in his love affair with that time period, I guess. But but it is interesting.
So the first Rocketeer comic, I guess you would say, is actually the last 6 pages of another comic book, which I had never heard of, called Star Slayer.
Yeah, me neither. Until you had sent me the book for this and we started reading it again, I also had no clue that this was not a standalone comic to begin with.
Yeah. I didn't either. I knew it was a comic, but to find out that it wasn't its own comic until, really, I think it was 2009 was the first time it was its own comic. I mean, they took all the pieces that were in the individual comics and they made collections, but it wasn't a standalone where original things were coming out until 2009.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because that was Dave's passing. It wasn't until he was, obviously they made a movie about his character, so he clearly did get some credit for it in his own lifetime, but no anthology was made or anything until he was passing away. He did get to choose the colorist, which is kind of cool. So he was involved in the creation of it being an anthology, but he didn't live to see it, which is a bit sad, but...
Well, and you mentioned the collection that you and I read. The collection you and I read actually was published in 2015, and it does say, like, the dedication at the beginning says, "For Dave, who always wanted to see this happen."
Yeah. I'm pretty sure this is the second run, not to get too deep into it, but IDW had done one previously. This is the second iteration of the collection, as far as what I could find, but we're getting...
Yeah, no, I'm with you. No, I do think this was a second run. But what I don't think IDW was behind the first one, because that's another thing about this comic is that it was published by so many different comic book publishers throughout the years. I mean, this is entirely, you talk about Dave Stevens, this is what he wanted. He picked, he was behind helped with the movie. He was behind the artist who took over. This was a passion project for him, and he did whatever he had to get this character out. And so he did jump around. Not everyone is in a Star Slayer comic. He jumped around to a couple of other different comics, just wherever he could find the pages to be put in.
Right. I think the biggest company he was published with was Dark Horse, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. But it's also my understanding that he did pitch the movie to Disney. So he was part of the pitch team that got the movie made, which is why he gets a producer credit and all that stuff. But so he was intimately involved in that as well, which is kind of funny when we start discussing the differences between the two. But
yeah. So, and we'll get into the background of the movie. So the movie was optioned in 1982, back when the character debuted in the comics. It did bounce around Hollywood. Disney eventually grabbed hold of it. And it's funny, the director, Joe Johnston, of this movie, he had just finished directing Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And his plan was to move on. He was like, I don't want to get trapped as a Disney director. But then he heard that Disney had got the rights to The Rocketeer. And Joe Johnston, being an artist himself, being a storyboard and creator. I mean, this guy created the design for Boba Fett. Joe Johnston.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yes, he helped.
Oh, wow.
I'm not saying he did it independently, but he was part of the team that created the look of Boba Fett. He was a huge Dave Stevens fan. And so he went to Disney and said, I want to direct this.
I did not know that until just IMDb'd this, kind of in research leading up to this. And once you see that, it's one of the things you can't unsee. The special effects in particular are very particular to him. When you compare Honey, I Shrunk the Kids to The Rocketeer, you see a lot of the same kind of motifs, even though he did a great job of making them two very different movies. You know, they don't artistically look the same or anything, but when you see the Rocketeer flying, you're like, yeah, that looks a whole lot like the bee that flies in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and that sort of thing. So, but
well, and also his want for using practical effects, because there's there's very little CGI. There's a lot of practical effects. But you talk about seeing the connection there. Again, the guy created Boba Fett, the original Rocketeer.
Yeah, no kidding. That's awesome.
Yeah. And of course, this would start Joe Johnston on a path to eventually lead him to direct Captain America, the First Avenger.
Yeah.
So you want to talk about an arc there, going from the unknown Rocketeer to Captain America himself, clearly showing that he's good at doing period superhero movies, setting the Rocketeer and Captain America, and he's a stickler for detail, just like Dave Stevens was in his drawings.
Yes, he is. My favorite is the shadow work. Throughout the movie, you have the shadow work that's very period correct, and it's pretty. I don't know. I just really enjoy his homages to the pulp comics of the 30s and that sort of thing, the old detective comics and all that. And you see it work throughout the movie, and I really appreciate his attention to detail on where the shadows go, because that's one of the things that drive me the most crazy is when a shadow is headed the wrong direction in a movie. I don't know if that makes sense or if anybody else cares about that sort of stuff, but it drives me nuts when it's, in the wrong aspect. So
yeah, no, shadow. You say shadows, the first thing I think of is Lothar bending that guy in half.
Yeah. Oh yeah. But even, you have the cowboy changes where you see the Rocketeer's shadow landing and then he pops up. You were talking about practical effects earlier. So, I mean, you can't afford to just fly this guy around on wires in every single set, that sort of thing. So, you see the Rocketeer's shadow come down, land, and then boop, in frame pops up the actor. And, so you get some neat little Hollywood things like that, but that you just don't see anymore. It's just too cheap to throw in a CGI flying person, apparently. So I really appreciate watching how they did it the old way, I guess.
Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and get into the characters and get to talking and enjoying this. I know both Chad and I were both at the ripe age for this movie when it originally came out. So we do have a lot of nostalgia for this. And now both being pop culture nerds, we got a lot to say. So let's get into the characters. We're going to start off with the Rocketeer himself, Cliff Secord, played by Billy Campbell. Kind of a relative unknown to play the starring role in this, although that always seems to work out in superhero movies.
Yeah, no kidding. Which you got to kind of wonder what Disney was doing in that sense, because Warner Brothers just had a huge success with Dick Tracy and cast arguably a top 2 or 3 leading man at the time, and Warren Beatty, big name cast, Madonna, all those people are in that movie. And then all of a sudden, this one's got a lot of kind of up and comers. They would be big in more movies, that sort of thing. So it is an interesting differentiation from other movies you saw at that time. But
yeah, because Warner Brothers has Batman with Michael Keaton, who was big in the 80s, Jack Nicholson, obviously Kim Basinger. And then you get Touchstone Pictures did Dick Tracy. And you got Al Pacino. You got Dustin Hoffman in a completely random cameo, almost unrecognizable appearance. And of course, Warren Beatty, not only starring, but also directing. And then that one goes on to be nominated. I don't know if it won, but be nominated for a few Academy Awards.
Yeah, I don't think it won any, but I don't know about you. I was actually trying to think of the first movie that really impacted my childhood. And those two are so close together, Batman and Dick Tracy. They were being advertised at the same time, but you couldn't go anywhere and not see stuff about those two movies. And probably the first time that media was on my mind as a young kid were those two movies, and The Rocketeer was a close third.
Yeah, I agree. I think Dick Tracy probably beats out Batman a little bit for me because it was a little bit more, I'm not going to say kid friendly, but it was because it was more colorful and bright. I think it struck me a little bit more. I remember dressing as Dick Tracy for Halloween one year, always acting like I was talking into my watch, which, nowadays we have the Apple Watches, so we actually do all that stuff.
That has come true. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah, for real.
But back to, Cliff, or Billy Campbell. The character, of course, is supposed to be he almost feels like he's supposed to be that farmer boy, Midwestern kid, although it's clear it's in California. And he's just supposed to be that good-hearted, a little innocent, kind of clueless and all kind of character. But at the same time, he's a jerk.
Yeah, he definitely got Disneyfied in the sense that in the movie, he's just kind of a little clueless, whereas in the comics, like he's way more. He makes some stupid decisions, and
very much so.
can be pretty heartless.
Especially when it comes to his girlfriend. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that's weird in the casting choice to me is he's like a foot taller than everyone else in this movie. He's a very large dude. And so which you don't get in the comics. He's kind of a regular guy.
Kind of a scrawny.
Yeah. So that was a little bit of a differentiation to me, especially because in the comics you have this duality of he's not the good-looking, super good-looking dude that's supposed to be the leading man kind of thing. So it's very on your mind. Why is he with the leading lady who's supposed to be this really beautiful girl? And so you have that. In this movie, you don't get that same juxtaposition. They look okay together. You know what I mean? So so that was a little bit different. And you're kind of like, Neville is supposed to be the good-looking dude that she's jealous of, and you're like, I don't know, like they both look like leading men to me. I don't kind of get the difference there, but
no, I totally agree, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. That it for me, it kind of took away a little bit of the character to have such a, like you said, such a leading man looking guy in Billy Campbell. And from what I gathered in my research, Billy Campbell, one of the things that landed him the role was he went and got his hair cut to look just like Cliff from the comic. So that haircut was something he chose to do, and whatever.
No, okay. It makes sense. And and he works, like nothing against Billy Campbell. He does a good job in it.
I agree. All right, let's move on to the up-and-coming Jennifer Connelly playing the kind of from the comic but brand new character of Jenny Blake.
Yep.
I do want to point this out. You were talking about Jennifer Connelly compared to Billy Campbell, compared to Timothy Dalton. Are you aware of the age ranges between these three actors?
Yes. Yeah. It's a pretty massive range. She's very much younger than any of them. So I did not do any research. You say up and coming. What had she done up until this period? I really probably should have done my homework here. Okay.
She had
Which
done
was a
Labyrinth
huge
5
movie.
years earlier.
So
yeah. I don't know if there's really anything else, which is why I still said up and coming. I know she did things between Labyrinth and Rocketeer, but I think Rocketeer was
Nothing
her next big
yeah.
one. So
gotcha.
So kind of going off of that, but going back to that age difference. So Jennifer Connelly was 20, I think, when they made this movie. So very young, 20 years old. Billy Campbell was 31 and Timothy Dalton was 44.
Yeah.
Which makes you go back to the scene where he's seducing her in his house, and you're just, you kind of get
a little creepy.
It's a little creepy.
Well, that whole scene is very creepy, but
it is.
We'll get into that, I'm sure.
So as I talked about earlier, the character is kind of based on a character. Cliff does have a girlfriend in the comic, but her name is Betty. Who is clearly supposed to be Betty Page.
Yeah.
The pinup
not
model.
masked
there's no
at
doubt.
all.
Yeah. Other than the fact they never say Betty Page, if you see her in the comic books, it is straight up Betty Page.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but she doesn't get a last name in the comics.
No.
She's just Betty.
She's
so
just
I mean,
Betty.
yeah, it is Betty Page. Let's be honest.
Yeah, you see, she is a model in the comic book. She gets she takes the risque photos.
Right. She's a pinup.
There is a full page pinup picture of her in the comic.
Yeah.
From what I gathered, Dave Stevens was a huge fan, and even though he tiptoed around other people and copyrights and all that, he flat out made it obvious this was Betty Page. And from what I heard, he actually sent Betty Page a check because he used her likeness.
Apparently they became friends late in her life, which is kind of an interesting side note. But yeah, I think that Disney, for their movies, especially in the early 90s, I think it was a very good call for them to more or less abandon the Betty character altogether and just come up with their own character. So the Jenny Blake character makes sense for a Disney movie because, you know, she, like we were talking about Cliff being a jerk, she's not, you know, really the upstanding Disney character you would hope for either. So they replace her with the much more kind of innocent, doe-eyed Jenny Blake instead. And, you know, I think it works. It's not, you know, super true to the source material, but yeah, it makes sense. And it, you know, honestly, it makes for a good movie. So I can understand why they did it.
I like the tie-in of making her an aspiring actress since they had the Neville Sinclair character be a famous actor and kind of having that tie-in. I think it gave her a really good story. I actually really liked her story and wish we had seen just a little bit more of it. I think she had a really good story in the movie. How do you think the movie, though, treated her? Because we say that they got away from the pinup idea of Betty Page, but yet they did some kind of sketchy stuff. I guess that's the best word I could use there. I mean, the W.C. Fields scene is what comes to mind.
Yeah. I don't think you could get away with that same scene today. I'm not sure. The blatant objectification and his, can't remember the way he words it, but obvious reference to her being well endowed. And it's a little creepy. I could have done without the pan down to
it's the fact they actually they frame her chest in the shot. Yeah, he says something like it's a pleasure, and then they frame down to show that he looks down her dress, and he goes, in fact, it's a double pleasure or something like that. He says the word double, and that's what sits it. But yeah, it's so. And then they kind of did it earlier too, when the little toy airplane's wheel lands in her soup, and it splashes up, and again they frame her chest, and I'm like, Disney.
But
come on.
I'm more meaning that the character of Jenny Blake.
Oh no, I knew what you meant there, but
she's much more innocent.
I agree.
She's not taking her clothes off for any of those things to happen, whereas Betty, she's a little more willing to do that.
Oh, yeah. So. All right, moving on to our villain. Spoiler alert. Neville Sinclair, played by post James Bond, Timothy Dalton. I think this was his first movie after doing his last James Bond movie.
Well, if you are a Bond nerd as well, you know that while you are contracted to be James Bond, you cannot wear a tuxedo.
Yes.
In any other, you can't even wear it to like movie premieres and stuff like that. And he is in a tux in this movie, so you know that it has to be outside of his contract to be James Bond. So
side note here, you reminded me very famous story of when Pierce Brosnan, who would then be the next Bond, he was in the Thomas Crown Affair, where he needed to wear a tux, and they agreed to let him wear a tux as long as he didn't wear the tie.
Yeah, he had to wear untied tie. Yep. Yeah, I remember that too.
But yeah, so Timothy Dalton, now this character's not from the comic books, but the same way that Dave Stevens used the comics as kind of an homage to those pulp comics and the things he grew up with in the 30s and 40s, you can tell that whoever was behind the screenplay here, which I didn't look up, when they created Neville Sinclair, they were clearly referencing old Hollywood. You know, we already mentioned about W.C. Fields popping up. We see Clark Gable. I didn't mention this. I think Jenny Blake, at least the look they give her, is very Elizabeth Taylor-esque.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. I think they still reference Betty Davis Betty Page, not Betty Davis, Betty Page with the hair in particular. So there's several homages going on. But Neville Sinclair is clearly Errol Flynn's evil twin. Like, it's
Well, you say that. Of course, again, the big twist at the end is finding out that Neville is a Nazi spy. There were actually people who thought Errol Flynn was a Nazi spy. So I think it was a dead on, like, he's supposed to be Errol Flynn. We just can't
I don't know of him murdering
the
anybody. Yeah. So it's, but yeah. And he does a great job. Timothy Dalton, despite it not being from the comics, he delivers. I mean, it's a very dated performance. If he made the same kind of over dramatic performance in a movie today, I feel like he would be panned for it, because we're super into, realism and actors bringing truth and all that kind of stuff. But I think he does a great job of overperforming, because that was that character. His at the end when he's explaining to Jenny Blake, it was all just acting all along, he's a psychopath that is bought into his own fame kind of thing. But I think he did a great job.
I got two questions I want to ask you about this character of Neville. Well, one is not really about the character. It's about something that happens. Why do you think there was something cut? What was the point of us finding out he accidentally stabbed his co-star?
I don't know.
Because that never came back.
It doesn't. And it doesn't help drive that scene either.
Yeah.
Because I was rewatching it. Obviously, it didn't mean that much to me when I was 10 years old and saw this originally. But rewatching it, I kind of was expecting that to provide some way that he then talked to Jenny Blake kind of thing. And it doesn't. It doesn't do anything. He just accidentally stabbed somebody. So now I'm kind of wondering, did one of the writers have like a uncle or something that got stabbed by Errol Flynn accidentally, and he just has it out for Errol Flynn? So he wrote this character. Like, I don't know, who knows.
Which would make sense considering the scene is about the girl being the director's niece.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and she's terrible. It's really cringeworthy.
Well, it's crazy, too. From the first time she delivers the line to then the second time she delivers the line, it's like, how did you all of a sudden get that much better in 2 minutes?
Well, the director's notes clearly made that much of a difference.
Yeah.
I also was wondering why they had to reset that entire scene, since it's obviously like a different camera angle that she's
it would be a close-up
delivering.
shot,
It's like, this makes no sense. She can deliver that line without going through an entire sword fight again. But whatever.
But now here's my second question: why does he have a closet full of women's clothing?
Well, all leading men should have a closet full of lingerie for the occasional visitor to their home. It's going back to the movie being made in a movie. Why is Jenny Blake fired and not the set carpenters who clearly didn't put like one nail in an entire wall to keep it from falling down on everybody?
Well, not just
Cliff Secord breathes on this wall and a whole wall falls down.
Yeah, because that's the thing. You don't even see him touch it. It just falls. And I mean, I do a lot of stuff in theater. I know that you're supposed to secure these walls.
Yeah. That carpenter should have been fired, not Jenny Blake. So that was
not just the carpenter too. The fact that he talked about it was a closed set. There's a guy closing the door as Cliff comes in, and I'm like, shouldn't that guy know? It doesn't say anything to it. It says nothing.
Yeah. That whole scene just cracks me up. It's pretty great.
No. Now, you talked about Timothy Dalton's, almost overacting. Let's talk about someone who probably delivers the best performance in this, and that is Alan Arkin as Peavy Peabody.
Yeah.
I mean, was there any flaw in his performance?
No. The only time that I kind of wondered what in the world's going through Peavy's head is when his entire house gets blown to bits by the cops, which that's a whole other story, why the cops would just turn automatic weapons on a residential house because one dude shot a couple times, but whatever. And he just runs away with Cliff, and there's never any kind of question at this point. Like, he still is trying to get Cliff to hand the rocket over to the authorities, but he doesn't. I kind of think, and this is obviously not Alan Arkin's fault, but I'm wondering if Peavy would have thrown in the towel at this point. Like, his place is destroyed. He's on the lam. Like, I don't know. But name a movie that Alan Arkin isn't perfect in. It's, he's an amazing dude. So
I actually, while doing my research on this, I found one person reviewing it who said Alan Arkin is great in every movie. He's the best part of every movie, whether he's in it or not. He's the best part of every movie.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome.
But of course, Peavy does kind of serve as the Rocketeer's version of both Alfred and Lucius Fox.
Right.
He's the father figure, but he's also the engineer who's creating everything.
Q. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and he's a little. I do like his portrayal of him and his like slightly self-absorbed with his own ideas. You know, while Cliff is risking his life, like that's kind of a secondary note. He's more interested in can he make this thing work than it might kill this dude. So it's pretty interesting.
Well, that's even at the end when Cliff and Jenny are, having their moment, and he's just sitting there looking at the blueprints. He goes, "Well, what about if he's just talking about, I guess, rebuilding the rocket?" But we'll get to that later. Let's also move to another character who gives a very interesting performance, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Not from the comics, but I think it tied in perfectly with this movie, and that was Howard Hughes, real-life person, Howard Hughes, portrayed in this movie by Terry O'Quinn. They make him the inventor of the rocket, which is different from the comic books, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Here's what I found interesting. No mention to Howard Hughes being an insane person.
Well, I mean, arguably he wasn't yet. This is 1938. He's, arguably the most famous man in America. His PR machine, which I don't think people give nearly enough credit to, is in its full swing at this time period. He does seem to be relatively sane. He didn't slip into, the crazy sitting in a theater all day and never cutting his fingernails and, all the other stuff that you heard about later.
In the bottles.
Yeah, that doesn't come until, a decade after this, and at least in the American consciousness. So, in 1938, this seems to be, a fairly reasonable Howard Hughes. I think it could have been played a little more eccentric than it was, but another actor that's fantastic in virtually everything he's in. So, great character actor. I like his performance.
Oh, I do too.
And you get the great moment where he realizes that the spruce goose can work.
Okay. I wanted to bring that up. Who watching this movie, other than history buffs like you, would know that was supposed to be the spruce goose, and that his line about it can fly is this whole reference.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't know until I actually looked it up.
Yeah, I'm doubly nerded down on that one because I'm also obsessed with Howard Hughes. He's such an interesting dude to me, but yeah, it's a very obscure reference.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Moving on, a character that actually is from the comics, and we'll get into a little bit more of how he's in the comic a little bit later, but that is the big dude, Lothar, played by Tiny Ron Taylor. Yes, he did go by the name Tiny. Tiny Ron Taylor. He is actually in a lot of other things. I actually realized I knew him. I didn't realize it was him until I did the research. But from the old police, what was the television show called? The Naked Gun, but the television show. But in the Naked Gun, whenever they would talk about this one detective and he'd come in to scream, but you never could see his face because he was always so tall, that was him. That was Tiny Ron Taylor. Now, he actually is in the movie without all the prosthetics. After Cliff does the first big rescue and then he crashes through the the cornfield or wheat field, whatever it was, the two farmers standing there, he's the one that doesn't speak. But that is actually Ron Taylor standing there when the other guy says, a big gopher. So that was actually him right there. Yeah.
No, that's interesting. Was he not? He was. Am I conflating the two? He was in Dick Tracy, wasn't he?
I don't think he was. I think it's just that his makeup made him look like he was from Dick Tracy.
Yeah, I think you might be right, but yeah, in my head, like that's almost the same character.
Yeah, because it really was like they took a character from the Dick Tracy movie and put them into this movie.
Yeah, he does a great job, and that character does what it's needed to do. But that is probably the one role that I think is unfortunate in its translation from the comic to the movie. And part of it is just those prosthetics did not work great. Like,
he sticks out. He seems like he doesn't belong.
He could barely speak through them. That's where it gets me, is when you take, maybe don't give him tight shots if you're going to go with that thick of, a prosthetic and everything. But when you first see him, when he visits the henchman in the hospital to get answers, and he's talking to him, and he can barely move his lips in these crazy prosthetics, and to me it takes a little something away.
I agree. The makeup and all is, again, going back to old Hollywood. He is meant to look like an actual actor from the early days of Hollywood by the name of Rondo Hatton, who was in a lot of kind of horror movies back in the 50s and around that same time that Dan Stevens was getting his inspiration. So, and again, you look that guy up, Rondo Hatton, look that name up and you will see that's exactly who he was supposed to be.
Right.
And finally, I just wanted to mention, again, another brilliant actor, Paul Sorvino, playing mobster Eddie Valentine. Great performance from him. Really, the only thing I have to say about the character is I like the tie-in with, you have the FBI, you've got the mobsters, you've got, ultimately you end up finding out the Nazis. And then once the mobsters find out the Nazis are involved, they pretty much switch sides, which is exactly what happened in a lot of America back in, the 1940s, is mobsters were like, look, exactly like he says, I may not earn a fair, a living, but I am American. And, that's exactly what happened in a lot of stuff with the 1940s and worrying about Nazi spies is, the mob would not deal with that.
And you get the great shot where they're engaging the Nazi commandos at the end, and Valentine's standing next to one of the, I can't remember which one's which, but one of the two main FBI agents that have been chasing the Rocketeer the whole time, and they're both just Tommy gunning away, and they look at each other in that very explicit, we're on the same side now moment and everything. It's pretty great.
Yeah, no, and that's what I liked about that character. Other than, again, Paul Sorvino, another great talented actor, and this movie was, and there was a lot of other people, some of the mobsters, some of the people in the background, like some of the guys that were in the cafe and the owner of the cafe, a lot of these character actors would just go, oh yeah, hey, I recognize him, I recognize her. The singer in the restaurant was Jan from The Office.
Who's the why is it escaping me now, who plays Clark Gable in that totally throwaway scene?
I don't know.
I can't remember who it is now, but that's a known actor as well. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting little pass-throughs on there. And I get it. It's a Disney project. There probably were other actors on the next soundstage over, and you just go, hey, you want to come over here and get a quick credit in this, or whatever. So it has a great cast. I think top to bottom, they do a fantastic job. Even though as a lover of the comic as well, I do kind of have a little bit of a beef with a couple of them, but it's really well acted.
All right, let's get into the moving panels of this, and we are going to focus just mainly on the stuff that Dave Stevens created, because that is what this movie is based off of, not the stuff that happened after or even after the movie when it continued even further. And the first thing I want to talk about is the most straight out of the comic thing, and that is the suit. That is the look of Cliff as the Rocketeer, the jacket, the helmet. Although I did find it interesting, and of course Howard Hughes makes the comment about saying that the fin is a rudder. That's not ever mentioned in the comic to my belief. You know, he does put the fin on it, but it's never said that it serves a purpose. So I do like that they did give it a purpose. Although it doesn't make any sense.
And the actual rocket itself looks different. It has kind of a two rocket backpack feel in the movie versus this like one, which is referenced in the movie.
Vacuum
the
cleaner,
Hoover vacuum actually looks like the Dave Stevens rocket, which is super funny. But oh yeah, the iconic shot at the end of the movie when he's standing on top of the observatory, flag is over him. I don't. This is from memory. I can't ever remember a panel in a book that has the flag like that, but his stance with the Mauser broom handle pistol, like that is straight from the books. Like Dave Stevens drew that panel, and even
the way he turns his head right when he makes that pose too. That's I thought great. The same thing. I was like that's a panel right there. That's a straight up panel right out of it. So definitely had to mention that. We talked about
had to be, which I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but like that has to be done specifically for that look because he doesn't even get to use the gun.
Yeah,
the Rocketeer in this movie never fires a gun. He then goes to the Zeppelin, at which he promptly loses the gun before he can ever do anything with it. So it was specifically for that shot.
Oh, definitely. But going back to the rocket pack, I love the look of this rocket pack. Nothing against the one that Dave Stevens came up with. But the rocket pack itself, I found it very interesting that even though Alan Ark and Peavy does talk about we don't know how much fuel's in this thing, what type of fuel and whatnot, there's never an issue with the fuel other than it leaking. Whereas I remember in the comic book, he straight up runs out of fuel one time when he's flying.
Yeah.
And then don't they find out it's like a special blend, like it's a special mix, like it's not just regular gasoline or...
Right. In the comics, it is a specialty fuel that's made at... It never tells you what laboratory it is. It is hinted that it's Howard Hughes. You earlier said that the Howard Hughes character wasn't from the books. So Howard Hughes never is explicitly in a panel like he is in the movies. But Peavy does engage the henchmen. I can't remember their names, but the kind of squat, bizarre-looking redheaded scientist and the Mr. Jeeves character. Yeah. And they argue back and forth that Peavy knows that they work for Howard Hughes, and they, of course, deny the whole thing. And so there is that in the book. So that wasn't just drawn straight out of thin air, Howard Hughes being in the movie, but you never see him. He never admits to being the inventor of the rocket pack, all that sort of stuff. But specialty fuel.
The guy who does admit to being the inventor is supposed to be implied, because he couldn't actually use the name, it's supposed to be Doc Savage.
Yes, but he still does say that. I don't know. They never give a name, and it's the same with another character we're obviously going to talk about a little later. I think Dave Stevens kind of played fast and loose with could be either way, kind of conflated characters, so it is kind of interesting. But my point was they didn't just draw Howard Hughes like out of the ether to be that character in the movie. Yeah, I think in the movie you do get this weird moment where Peavy is smelling the fuel and he's like, "Oh, it's alcohol." And they never revisit that. Yeah. They never show him refilling it or anything. He doesn't ever seem to run out of fuel. It is kind of weird, but
which does seem crazy for what all he does.
I would have loved to see a version of the comic run where he does run out of fuel. That's a pretty cool story, but that's more or less where the movie ends. If you try to look at the books and see how far the movie goes, it's really only the first half of the Dave Stevens work that they use for the movie. And so kind of once you're done with the Nazis, obviously the movie's over. That's only about the halfway point for the books. But
and There's not even Nazis involved in the Dave Stevens story.
It is German spies. They never explicitly call them Nazis or anything, and there's never like a head Nazi like the Neville character at all. But and they're not trying to steal the rocket pack. They're trying to steal some airplane. What do they call it? The Locusts or something.
I do remember that.
That to me is kind of some of what I was talking about when we first started out, in that Dave Stevens was clearly more worried about artwork than storytelling. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. No. The artwork is amazing, but the fact that Nazis are trying to steal, American technology is this like weird little subplot that they use just to show you the inventor of the rocket pack, and that Cliff kind of sort of tries to give it back in a weird way. So I don't know.
Another thing that just jumps off the page, which I think it's crazy that they would go and build this thing, is the Bulldog Cafe.
No kidding. I can't believe I forgot to bring that up right away. It is amazing that they actually built that. It's a great panel. Yeah, it looks gorgeous in the book, and then when you see it on the screen, it's kind of unrealistic. Like it is very strange that somebody got paid to build a bulldog eatery in real life, but it's awesome.
Yeah, it looks just like it, and it's believable. I mean, the cafe's not that big on the inside. Then they've got that kind of attic, which is clearly inside the dog's head.
Right.
And
you can look out the eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very believable. I found that very interesting. Now, cool. You talked about in the comic, a lot of this really just comes from that first half of the first story. And we do see the debut of the Rocketeer during a rescue of a stunt gone wrong. And it's Malcolm. He replaces Cliff in the little air circus. I think they don't really go this because it is a Disney movie. I think in the comic he's drunk.
It's much darker in the comics. Yeah. It's not. It is still the character Malcolm is trying to save Cliff's job, so you still get the direct replacement there. But
I love
he's
that
just
in the
making
movie, up. In the movie, they give him like a real reason for why he's wanting to do it. Whereas in the comic, it's just he's a friend, and then he just hops in to help
and he's
Cliff.
Inebriated, so he decides stupidly to jump in an airplane and to do this. Yeah, no, 100%. I actually kind of like this. I'm with you. I like the storyline in the movie actually a little bit better. He feels responsible for ending Cliff's relationship with Jenny in his faux pas saying about the crash the day before, which is not from the movies, or not from the book, I mean. So that, it makes a cohesive beginning to the movie that I think is better than the book.
I agree.
I tend to lean toward the book almost every single time. But the story in the book is very short. You just have the guys run into the hangar and throw the jetpack into one of the planes, and off they go. Mm-hmm. And this one is way more interactive. There's much more action with the plane, all that sort of stuff. So, and you have a reason that Cliff should have been doing that, because he lost the GB in that initial scene. So it makes a lot more sense all around. And you wouldn't have felt for Malcolm at all if you had just made the movie version of the book directly, I think.
I agree. And what he does is actually, what's crazy is you see it, and he's selling, programs, and then all of a sudden he realizes, oh, hey, Cliff's not here. I got to go in. And then he's just randomly dressed like a clown. And unless you realize that apparently Cliff is doing the drunken pilot bit, which was actually something a pilot did back in those days in these airplane shows, is that he would act like he was drunk, get into the plane, but then all of a sudden, because he's quote unquote drunk, he'd do these crazy stunts in the plane. And that was the bit. But in this movie, unless you know that, you're just going, why is he dressed like a clown?
Yeah. I do think the movie kind of, like you were talking about with the Howard Hughes thing later on, the whole Spruce Goose moment, there are some things that you do have to be in the know on a very specific, 1930s aviation history to really understand. It's a great scene, though. You feel it introduces you to Cliff being this can't stand by and let bad things happen to people, character. So you get the beginnings of his heroics, that this is in his nature. It's his character. It's not just because he all of a sudden has, the power of this jetpack kind of thing. So it gives them the opportunity to name him the Rocketeer. You get that great scene.
What did you think of that scene? Of him seeing Pioneer and thinking Rocketeer.
That is what it is. It was funny, at least. I don't know. Yeah. I feel like it works inside the kind of framework and reality that they make for that movie. So, but yeah, it's another forced. Just the actor just overplays that whole role, and I think, and obviously it's on purpose. Like it's meant to be that almost vaudevillian kind of thing.
So now they did change the rescue slightly. In the comic book, he flies up and then he's hit by the plane. In this one, he crashes into it. I like the crash and that it causes, although it's funny that it makes the handle fly off and knock out Malcolm.
But then the rudder or the stick gets used again, just like a scene later, to pitch it, upward. There's not a lot of continuity there if you're a real aviation buff.
Honestly, I didn't even pay attention to that. I was just so wrapped up in the scene. I love going back to, I talked about earlier, the practical effects. I love when he falls off the plane and they clearly have a stuntman who is skydiving, and they do it twice. I don't know if it didn't look like the same shot to me. It looked like two different shots, but yeah.
I think you're right.
It's just so, and I love the second one. The second when he falls and he goes behind the cloud, and then you see the flash in the cloud, and then and that's when it switches to the CGI.
Yeah,
and I thought that was genius.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. Yeah, I was with you. Like, especially the first fall off of the plane, you're like, that's a skydiver. That's a human that just jumped off of an airplane. But
all right, let's talk about the Nazis really quick. So here was my thing about the Zeppelin. Or should we call it the Trojan horse, if you will? Which, here's the thing, and I'm actually going to put this into when we give our final decision, I'm going to say this again. When it shows up, my initial thought was, how has no one seen this giant Zeppelin with a Nazi logo on the swastika on the tail fin? And it wasn't until I rewatched it again that I went, oh, they do mention why it's flying around in America at the very beginning of the movie. But it's something you just forget about.
Yeah, it's on a goodwill tour. You gotta... They don't do a good job of keeping you in the reality that this is 1938, not 1944. So that would not be completely outlandish. The Nazis weren't necessarily bad guys yet, even though a lot of people saw the dark clouds on the horizon. But you're right. And the other part of that scene that drives me crazy is uniformed German commandos. Are just in LA, apparently. Like getting shot up by the FBI. Yeah. Not very good spycraft when you leave dead commandos in uniform, laying around after a giant firefight.
But just really quick, another thing that was kind of unbelievable to me. People get knocked out really easily in this movie.
Yeah, when Jenny Blake just crashes a vase lightly onto Neville's head and he's out like a light. Yep, totally agree. The frying pan to me is a little more realistic. I feel like if you get clocked, pretty hard on the head with a frying pan, that one might do it, but...
Well, and then Jenny hits Lothar with some little statue and knocks him out.
In the club scene. Yeah, I forgot about that.
You're like, how in the world did 90-pound Jenny just knock out 8-foot tall Lothar, this monster of a guy?
And then gathers up her dress and runs away. It's great.
Yeah. Speaking of things that happened a little too easily, they did not make very good quality windows in that Zeppelin either.
every window in the cockpit gets knocked out at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. Seems very, just lean up against it and it shatters and you fall out.
That, and I love our pilot's the best pilot there is, and then immediately gets knocked out, out. When I say out, he didn't get knocked out. He got knocked out of the Zeppelin. So
yeah,
he's gone.
Going to the Nazis too. What is it with a movie in this time frame having Nazis? There has to be a Nazi that is in a black trench coat, black fedora, and little round glasses. I half expected to see his face melt off later from the Rocketeer blasting his rocket in his face or something.
That, and why do the Germans continue to follow Neville's commands after this British-American actor shoots their leader and then just starts bossing them around? I don't know. There's a very loose chain of command here, I feel like, but
yeah.
I don't know.
All right, let's talk about some other elements that came in Dave Stevens' other run, which is called The Rocketeer's New York Adventure. It's where he's quote-unquote ended his relationship with Betty. They're kind of on the outs, and Betty goes to New York to work with this photographer that's going to make her famous, which is where I think a lot of this Neville storyline does come from.
Sure.
It's this photographer that Cliff doesn't quite trust, and he follows suit to New York, and then we get the whole adventure of New York. And that's where the character of Lothar comes in, which is a complete separate storyline in which Lothar is a circus performer who is seeking vengeance on all of these other circus performers on the death of this other circus performer that he was in love with. And it was just all so confusing. But that's, of course, where Lothar comes in. And yeah, there's just a lot in that one. Plus the fact, and we'll go ahead and throw this out there, he's helped by a friend who is working for a guy that we find out is named Jonas, who, if you know, again, old comic books, you realize he's the Shadow.
Yeah. He even says, he doesn't say I am the Shadow or something like that, but there's a
copyright.
Yeah, there's a bizarre scene though where he lights a match in a very dark room in Cliff's face, and he says something about that he always works from the shadows, or something to that effect. I can't remember the line word for word, but very, very clear homage slash ripoff, whichever way you want to go with it. But yeah, the Shadow is in this comic, which is great. Obviously a huge 1920s, 30s pulp, comic character. So really cool for him to be in the book. It is a really strange run. Cliff, Betty, I can't even begin to understand where their relationship is, because Cliff is being a bonehead and he's not really talking to Betty about what he's doing as the Rocketeer. She knows way earlier in the books than, or Jenny does, I should say, doesn't really know about Cliff being the Rocketeer until far later in the movie. Then you get Betty knowing about it in the comic run. She very early gets kidnapped and, has all of these terrible things happen to her. So they're kind of on the outs because he won't hand the rocket back. And then she just decides to go to Paris because this dude says that it's going to be good for her career. Yeah. So she lies to Cliff that she's going to stay with her aunt for a month or two, and is on her way to Paris when Cliff realizes what's really going on and goes to confront her in New York. And then he decides that he should just kick her to the curb, that it's better for both of them, all this sort of stuff. And that's how he meets the club owner that is the Shadow, who offers him a job. So it's a very convoluted way to get the guy into the story, but it's some of the most beautifully drawn work. I love the scenes where the Shadow and Cliff are fighting together as they kind of go after a very unknown crime syndicate, apparently, that is harboring this Lothar character. And so you get into that whole strange Carney story. You do get Lothar as we see him in the movie, though. As much fun as I made of the prosthetics earlier, they did an incredible job of taking a very much comic drawn thing and putting it on the screen. It is pretty cool. And I would argue it's part of the iconic work that is The Rocketeer. So even though it's displaced story-wise, it looks great in the movie, and I'm glad that they did it. And I'm not sure that you could make that story into a movie. Let's be honest. It's a little off the wall.
You couldn't. If you maybe did a television series, possibly, but definitely not a movie.
Yeah.
All right, and finally, we want to talk about sequels. So, from what I found out, Disney, when they optioned this story, their plan was to make a trilogy.
Yeah.
And of course, it didn't do very well in theaters. But my question is do you think they made this movie still thinking they would do a trilogy? Because they do destroy the rocket.
They do destroy the rocket, but Peavy still has the schematics that Jenny saves. And he's talking about how to better build the next one. So they clearly were leaving that on the table. I mean, you could throw Peavy out of the last scene if you're not trying to set up a sequel. So there is that possibility. And that's been batted around for forever. There's been rumors about, a reboot of that character and everything, which I very biasedly would still love to see. I think it's a great property, but
do you want a reboot or do you want a sequel?
Oh man, at this stage,
well, maybe. So let me throw this out to you. Are you aware that there is a cartoon?
No.
Like currently?
No.
Yeah. There's currently on, I don't know if it's on actual television, but I've seen it on Disney Plus. And it's called The Rocketeer, or The Rocketeers. Maybe it has an S on it. But I haven't seen a single episode of it, but I read a synopsis. And what it is this little girl who is named Kit Secord receives a package, and it is the rocket.
Yeah.
And, it's the suit. And she finds out that Cliff was her grandfather or great-grandfather, and he has given her the rocket to become the new Rocketeer. Now, we're talking a kid,
right?
Like, we're not talking a 20-something-year-old. We're talking a kid becomes the new Rocketeer, and it's this animated kid show on Disney right now. But just that the fact that they have made that, like, do we want to see Billy Campbell return as the Rocketeer? Do we want to see Billy Campbell pass the rocket on to someone else, or do we want to a full reboot and have a brand new Cliff Secord and do a brand new story?
Man, so for me personally, I would prefer to see a reboot, I think, in the sense of the iconography there of the 1930s aviation scene, the GB planes, the Barnstormer, the biplane, and that whole like culture of the beginnings of aviation and Howard Hughes, and all of that to me is a big part of what the Rocketeer is. So I definitely personally would not want to see a very modern version of that. Now, if you bring Billy Campbell back and you have him hand it to his son in 1950, that to me kind of works a little differently, or 1958, so he's 20 or something, whatever. But that I think could still work, because you can still use a lot of that same kind of beginnings of commercial aviation, and post World War II, the space race. You can use some of that stuff. So I mean, maybe you can do a continuation, but I personally am not super interested in a ultra modern version of that.
Yeah, it would probably be more the 60s, because even if he and Jenny had a kid very quickly, the movie did take place in October of 1938.
Sure.
So
yeah, 59, 60, some early 60s. Yeah. That's still like pre 62, when JFK makes the famous speech about us landing a man on the moon before the decade's out, all that sort of stuff. So I think you could still do that and have that kind of passion for aviation and the space era and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I think you could still get away with that. But
I honestly think tying it in with the space race would be very interesting.
Yeah, I think you could go a lot of places there, but then you can't I don't know, man. Like, part of the magic of that movie is those homages, like the shadow use and all that sort of stuff. To me, granted, I am extremely biased. Like we were talking about, this is one of the first movies that really meant something to me, that I wanted to go see and told my parents that, you know, we got to go do this kind of thing. And so I am very biased and will admit that. But, you know, there are definitely clever ways that you can still use some of that stuff, or make it something newer. But I do think that the early '60s would probably be the cutoff for me personally to see that character. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, for one, like, where, you know, the guy's wearing a brass finned helmet that looks like a 1957 Bel Air. You know, it's it's not going to work great in 2020 or something. But
yeah, look like a hood ornament. Greatest line in the movie.
Yeah. It is.
All right, so let's get to our final decision, our bag it, stack it, or trade it. So, Chad, as the guest, I'll let you go first. Do you bag it, stack it, or trade it?
I know this is a shocker as I've waxed poetic about this thing, but yeah, for sure. For me, it is definitely a bag it. I love the artwork. I think that Dave Stevens is an incredibly talented guy. It's very, very, very beautiful work, and they did an incredible job of bringing it to the screen. So you have those fantastic scenes where he poses straight out of the books. You have the great practical effects that are just, even with a modern eye, it's still fun to watch. And you get the curtain drawn back a little bit and see how the movie making is done. That just, I don't think you can do anymore. You know, computers have taken some of the fun out of movies in that sense, in my opinion. So that stuff's pretty neat. And I do think it's just an interesting character, just a normal dude who finds this incredible piece of technology and gets caught up in something bigger than himself. So it's a fun movie.
Yeah, you know, after that, you pulled me, because I'm going to tell you, I was on the fence between bagging it and stacking it. Mm-hmm. And here's my argument as to why I was really leaning towards just saying stack it. So the movie, as I mentioned earlier, it couldn't capitalize off of following Batman, the blockbuster that was Batman, the critically acclaimed Dick Tracy that came out the year before. Honestly, I think if this movie had come out before the two of those, it actually would have been bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really do. Make the exact same movie, just make it come out in 87, Yeah. I think it could have been that much bigger. But here was my thing, and we kind of talked about this with Dave Stevens with the comic, is the story is just, even for a movie that's only a little over an hour and a half, it's slow. It is a slow moving story. I mean, I mentioned earlier about when the Zeppelin shows up at the end, I have already forgotten that it was mentioned at the beginning and that there was a tie-in. And so that's where I kind of, and to me, and we kind of talked about this too with Billy Campbell being such a leading man, is I wanted more of the Rocketeer and not Cliff being the hero. I wanted the Rocketeer. Because I kind of had a problem with, he never speaks when he's in the helmet.
Oh, yeah.
He never talks.
Yeah, I never thought about that, but yeah.
And I just, if I want a superhero movie, I want my superhero, not the person who is the superhero. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting note. And I like thinking back to the books, it's pretty rare he speaks in the helmet. But he does. He thinks a lot, though. He thinks a lot, yeah. You get his thought bubbles quite often.
Yeah, he thinks a lot.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember him like yelling. I don't know if it was Lothar or who I remember him talking to people. I mean, I'm not talking Spider-Man level of talking where he's throwing quips and all that.
Sure.
But that was my thing. Again, the nostalgia is there. I'm right with you on this. And let me tell you, James Horner's score to this movie adds so much to that.
Yeah.
When this movie starts, just when it starts, and you hear those first few chords of that music, and then it starts showing them move the plane, I remember going, this immediately is taking me back. This is immediately making me feel like I'm a 10-year-old kid again, watching the movies that I love.
Yeah.
And James Horner, I mean, you realize he'd just done Field of Dreams like a few years before this.
Yeah.
Done the music for Field of Dreams, another one that does that. And he would later do Apollo 13 and Titanic. Mm-hmm. So this guy can do a score. And the score for this movie, I think, is so great. And so that's, again, the nostalgia aspect of it, the fact that I loved this character as a kid. I was so into this character as a kid. The comic book, as you said, is great. But again, it's the story. Yeah. And in the movie, the story to me is just too slow. I mean, Jenny has almost as much action as Cliff does when she's, trying.
Yeah.
So I just, to me, it was, I need more Rocketeer. So I'm going to stick with what I originally thought. And I'm going to say it's a stack it, but it's almost a bag it.
Nice.
But I am just going to stack it. All right. Any last thoughts, Chad, on this great movie from our childhood celebrating its 30th anniversary?
Yeah, give it a watch. It definitely is aged. I mean, you can tell that it's not a modern movie, but I still argue that it's totally worth a view. It really is a well-made movie by people who clearly cared about the idea at the very least behind the character, and it's a pretty fun movie.
Yeah, and although they do throw in there is a couple of pieces of language, it is a good family movie. Good fun one to watch together on the weekend or something. But I recommend it too. All right, thanks, Chad, and thanks everybody for listening. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Let us know that you enjoy this show as much as we enjoy making it. And follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Moving Panels. And you can email us, movingpanels@gmail.com. But for today, I want to thank everybody for listening. I'm Laramy Wells, and I'll see you on the other side of the page.
Hello movie viewers and fellow movie lovers. My name is Tim Williams and I'm the creator and host of Movie Views Presents the 80s Flick Flashback Podcast. See, I love the 80s and I have a great appreciation and nostalgic passion for the classic 80s flicks that birthed my love for movies and ultimately helped shape my childhood. On each episode, I'll discuss, with a special guest co-host of course, a different film from the 1980s. We'll share memories, favorite characters, iconic scenes, and even share some behind-the-scenes stories along the way. We'll discuss famous blockbusters like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Coming to America, Ghostbusters, Dirty Dancing, Top Gun, Die Hard, and many, many more. As well as some other cult classics and even lesser-known flicks we discovered on cable TV or the now-defunct video rental stores. Remember those? No matter what 80s flick we choose to talk about, we'll always have a good time, so come and check us out. You can find the 80s Flick Flashback Podcast on major podcasting platforms like Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and more. Be sure to subscribe or follow so you don't miss a single episode. Once again, I'm Tim Williams, and I hope you'll join me for the next 80s Flick Flashback.